Imagine waking up in the morning. You get out of bed, walk to the bathroom and brush your teeth with refreshing mint paste. Then you step into a hot shower, wash your hair with fragrant shampoo, and dry yourself with a clean towel. Afterward, you apply deodorant, comb your hair and put on clean clothes that were washed just days ago. Now imagine waking up in medieval Europe. You rise from your flea-infested mattress that you share with your entire family. You don't take a shower. In fact, you haven't had a full bath in the last 3 months. Your teeth are rotting because you've never brushed them. Your clothes haven't been washed for weeks and reek of sweat and urine. And the worst part? You think this is completely normal. Welcome to medieval hygiene, where what we consider basic today was non-existent, and practices that would make us vomit were daily routine. This is the medieval truth your history teacher probably never had the stomach to tell you. If you're enjoying this dive into the shadows of the past, don't forget to subscribe to Between Shadows and Kings for more dark historical revelations that will change how you see the world forever. Let's start with what might be the most shocking aspect of medieval hygiene, or rather, the lack of it. Contrary to what you might believe, the average medieval person wasn't particularly concerned with being clean. In fact, many actively avoided it. But why? The answer lies in a perfect storm of religious superstition, medical misinformation, and practical limitations that created a world where filth wasn't just common, it was sometimes considered virtuous. The medieval attitude toward bathing was, to put it mildly, complicated. After the fall of the Roman Empire, with its sophisticated public bath systems, Europe took a dramatic step backward. The Church began associating cleanliness with vanity and bathing with moral looseness. Many religious figures even promoted the idea that filthiness was a sign of holiness, a physical manifestation of one's disregard for worldly concerns. Saint Francis of Assisi proudly wore the same unwashed robe for years, while St. Agnes never bathed at all during her entire lifetime, considering her filth a badge of honor. But religious zealotry wasn't the only reason medieval people avoided water. Medical theory of the time warned that water, especially warm water, opened the pores and made the body vulnerable to illness. Physicians genuinely believed that bathing could allow deadly miasmas, or disease-causing vapors, to enter the body. This wasn't entirely irrational. Bathing in the communal, rarely changed water of public bathhouses genuinely did spread disease. The Black Death only reinforced these fears, as communities with bathhouses seemed to suffer higher mortality rates during plague outbreaks. The reality check here is that bathing wasn't entirely absent from medieval life. The wealthy did occasionally bathe, albeit rarely, perhaps 3 or 4 times a year. Some medieval medical texts even recommended occasional bathing for health reasons, but these were the exceptions, not the rule. For most people, a full-body bath was a rare luxury, often reserved for special occasions like weddings or major religious festivals. But here's where things get truly repulsive. If medieval Europeans weren't bathing, how did they handle their body odor? The answer is that they largely didn't. Body odor wasn't considered particularly offensive. It was just how humans smelled. When everyone reeks, no one notices the stench. However, the truly wealthy did try to mask their odors with liberal applications of perfumes and aromatic herbs, creating a nauseating combination of putrid body odor overlaid with cloying fragrances. Some people attempted a form of dry cleaning by rubbing themselves with linen cloths or changing their linen undergarments, if they could afford them, believing that the linen would absorb the body's impurities. Others might wash just their hands and face occasionally, the only parts of the body regularly exposed, but a complete washing of the entire body, that remained a rarity that most people might experience only a handful of times in their entire lives. Now let's talk about something even more disgusting: medieval dental hygiene. Imagine never brushing your teeth, not for a day, not for a week, but never. That was the reality for virtually everyone in medieval Europe. There was no such thing as a toothbrush as we know it, no toothpaste, no dental floss, and certainly no regular dental checkups. The results were as horrific as you might imagine. By their 20s, most people had severely decayed teeth. By 40, many had lost a significant number of teeth entirely. Tooth extraction was one of the most common surgical procedures of the medieval period, usually performed by barbers or blacksmiths without anesthesia, using crude pliers. The screams of patients having teeth pulled were so common in town squares that they barely drew attention. Some attempts at dental care did exist, but they were often worse than doing nothing at all. People would rub their teeth with rough cloths dipped in abrasive substances like ground shells or ash. which wore away the enamel and accelerated decay. Others used mixtures containing honey or other sweet substances, ironically feeding the very bacteria causing their dental problems. For bad breath, which must have been universally atrocious, people would chew on herbs like mint or fennel, or rinse their mouths with wine or vinegar. The wealthy might use toothpicks made of metal, but most people used wooden splinters, which often splintered between teeth and caused painful infections. The truly disturbing part: rotting teeth were so common that they weren't even considered a medical problem. They were simply an expected part of aging, like wrinkles or gray hair. The pain was something you endured until the tooth either fell out or became so unbearable that extraction was necessary. Many medieval skulls show evidence of abscesses that would have caused excruciating pain for years before death. But here's a reality check. Despite this horrific dental situation, medieval people did care about having fresh breath for social interactions. They just addressed it with temporary measures like chewing herbs, rather than addressing the underlying decay. And some monasteries did develop basic oral hygiene routines, with monks using salt rubs or herbal preparations to clean their teeth, showing that knowledge of dental care existed, even if it wasn't widely practiced. Now, let's move on to something truly revolting: how medieval people handled their waste. Today we take for granted the private, sanitary disposal of human waste. In medieval times, the concept would have seemed like an unimaginable luxury. For most medieval city dwellers, the bathroom was wherever was convenient, often the street right outside their door. People would simply throw their waste out windows into the street below, occasionally with a warning shout of "Garde l'eau," a corruption of the French garde à l'eau, or "watch out for the water." The streets of medieval cities were literally flowing with human excrement, especially after rainfall, creating what one contemporary writer called rivers of filth. In castles and large manor houses, things weren't much better. While they did have designated toilets called garderobes, essentially holes in stone seats that emptied directly outside the castle walls, the result was still piles of human waste accumulating around the structure. The smell must have been unbearable, especially in summer. Many castles had these garderobes built into small chambers that jutted out from the castle walls, creating the medieval equivalent of an outhouse, except that instead of a pit below, there was often just open air, with waste splashing onto the ground, or sometimes directly into the moat. Speaking of moats, those romantic water features surrounding castles, they were effectively open sewers, collecting not just human waste from the garderobes, but also animal waste, food scraps, and any other garbage produced by the castle's inhabitants. The stagnant, fecal-filled waters surrounding medieval castles were breeding grounds for disease and produced an almost unimaginable stench. Even monasteries, supposedly places of purity and order, had communal toilets where monks would sit side by side on long wooden benches with holes cut into them, defecating in full view of their brothers. Privacy during elimination is a surprisingly modern concept. The reality check here is that while this system was disgusting by our standards, medieval people did make some attempts at sanitation. Some cities had rudimentary sewage systems, usually open gutters running down the middle of streets, and passed laws forbidding the dumping of waste in certain areas or at certain times. London had gong farmers, who were paid to collect human waste from cesspits and dispose of it outside the city. But these measures were woefully inadequate for the population density of medieval cities, resulting in living conditions that were, quite literally, shit-covered. But perhaps the most skin-crawling aspect of medieval hygiene was how people dealt with parasites. Today, finding a single louse in your child's hair is cause for emergency shampooing and thorough cleaning. In medieval Europe, having a head full of lice was simply a fact of life, so common that it wasn't even considered a problem. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, and other parasites were unavoidable companions for virtually everyone, from peasants to kings. They lived in people's hair, clothing, bedding, and homes in numbers that would horrify modern sensibilities. Contemporary accounts suggest that even royalty was infested. Medieval chronicles occasionally mention kings absent-mindedly picking lice from their clothing during state functions, as casually as we might check our phones during a meeting today. These parasites weren't just disgusting, they were deadly. Fleas were the primary vector for the Black Death that killed up to half of Europe's population in the 14th century. Yet medieval people had no concept of this connection and took few effective measures against these pests. The methods they did use were often ineffective or dangerous. People would rub their bodies with mixtures containing mercury or arsenic to kill lice, substances that were poisoning them slowly, even as they provided temporary relief from parasites. Others used herbs like lavender or pennyroyal, which had some genuine repellent properties, but couldn't possibly address full-blown infestations. For the wealthy, one solution was to shave their heads completely and wear wigs, which could be removed and baked in ovens to kill the lice, a practice that continued well into the 18th century. The rest of the population simply lived with constant itching and irritation, using special combs to remove some of the parasites and their eggs, but never achieving anything close to complete elimination. The truly nightmarish part: bedding was rarely washed and often filled with straw or other organic materials that provided perfect breeding grounds for these parasites. When you went to sleep in a medieval bed, you were effectively entering an ecosystem of thousands of biting, blood-sucking creatures that considered your body their feeding ground and toilet. Now, for a reality check, medieval people weren't entirely passive about parasites. They did recognize them as annoying and developed various tools and techniques to manage infestations. Special fine-toothed combs for removing lice have been found in archaeological sites across Europe, and some herbals contain recipes specifically for repelling or killing parasites. But without an understanding of how these creatures reproduced or spread disease, medieval people were fighting a losing battle against an enemy they couldn't possibly defeat with their available knowledge and technology. Let's talk about something equally revolting: medieval laundry practices, or the stunning lack thereof. In an age before washing machines, detergents, or even a regular supply of soap, keeping clothes clean was a monumental challenge that most people simply didn't bother to meet. The average medieval peasant owned perhaps 2 sets of clothes, one for everyday wear and one slightly better outfit for special occasions. These garments were worn continuously, day after day, accumulating sweat, food stains, dirt, and worse. They might go unwashed for months or even years. When clothes were finally washed, the process was so labor-intensive that it was considered a major household event. Laundry day, when it eventually came, was brutal work. Without soap as we know it, clothes were often washed in mixtures containing lye, made from wood ash, stale urine, which contains ammonia, and various herbs. These harsh substances did break down some dirt and grease, but also damaged the fabric and left their own powerful odors behind. Clothes were beaten with paddles, trampled underfoot in tubs, and wrung out by hand, a process so physically demanding that it was considered one of the most grueling household chores. But here's the truly disgusting part: urine was considered such an effective cleaning agent that people actually collected it for laundry. In some towns, there were designated places where men were encouraged to urinate into collection vessels. This urine was then used, after being allowed to go stale and develop its ammonia content, to wash clothes, bedding, and even as a mordant for setting dyes in textiles. Yes, medieval clothes were literally washed in human waste. For the wealthy, the situation was somewhat better. They owned more clothes and could afford to have them washed more frequently by servants. But even for nobility, the concept of clean clothing would fall far short of our modern standards. Their expensive garments, often made of delicate fabrics and decorated with jewels or embroidery, couldn't withstand frequent harsh washing. Instead, they might be spot cleaned or aired out, practices that did little to address the deeper filth embedded in the fabric. The reality check here is that medieval people did recognize the value of clean clothing, particularly for special occasions. Religious ceremonies, weddings, and other important events would prompt people to wash their better clothes if possible. And linen undergarments, when available, served a practical hygienic purpose. They could be washed more frequently than outer garments and provided some barrier between the body and the rarely washed outer clothes. But these were exceptions to the general rule of wearing filthy, malodorous clothing as a simple fact of daily life. So there you have it, the revolting truth about medieval hygiene laid bare. A world where bathing was feared, teeth rotted in mouths, streets flowed with excrement, parasites were constant companions, and clothes reeked of stale sweat and urine. A world where the simplest hygienic practices we take for granted today were either unknown, impractical, or actively avoided. The next time you step into a hot shower, brush your teeth with mint-flavored paste or put on freshly laundered clothes. Take a moment to appreciate just how far we've come from the filthy reality of medieval life. Because if you were suddenly transported back to that time, the smell alone might kill you before the plague ever got the chance. And if you thought this was disgusting, Just wait until you hear about medieval medicine, where the treatments were often more deadly than the diseases. But that's a story for another time. Don't forget to subscribe to Between Shadows and Kings for more dark historical revelations that will forever change how you see the world. Because history isn't just dates and kings, it's the gritty, often repulsive reality of how people actually lived.